Welcome to our conversation on Islamophobia. Today, we are honored to hear from Dr. Sajoo and Dr. Jasmin Zine on the topic of Islamophobia and the global aftermath of terrorism in society, including its impact on Muslims from civil liberties to personal identity and citizenship. While we wish we were in person together today as originally planned, we know that hosting this program in a virtual space has allowed many more of us to be here together. My name is Alina Lalji. I am the chair of the Youth and Sports Board for the City of Toronto Committee and will be your MC today. We would like to begin our program by acknowledging the rich and enduring history of the Indigenous peoples in Ontario. I am joining you from a land that is ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and in particular, the Mississaugas of the New Credit. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, there have been Aboriginal people who have been stewards of this place. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions of the Métis, the Inuit, and the other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. Land acknowledgements are an important step in reconciliation, but the work does not end here. I encourage you to learn more about history of the Indigenous peoples where you work and live. Now, as many of you already know, Dr. Amyn Sajoo has hosted this series since 2018 with eminent onstage guests from academia, the arts, and social activism. He lectures at Simon Fraser University's School for International Studies and is scholar in residence at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. Dr. Sajoo's research and teaching focus on human rights, transnational law, and public religion with a special regard to effective citizenship. He was just invited as an expert witness before the Canadian Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights and its hearings on Islamophobia. In his early career with the Canadian Department of Justice and Global Affairs, he served as the Canadian ASEAN Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, followed by academic affiliations at Cambridge and McGill Universities and the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. Dr. Sajoo is the author of Pluralism in Old Societies and New States and Muslim Ethics, and the editor of Muslim Modernities, Expressions of Civil Imagination. He is a contributing editor of the Muslim Heritage series, in which its fifth publication, The Sharia, History, Ethics, and Law, was selected as a 2019 Choice Outstanding Academic Title by the American Library Association. He has contributed extensively to the news media, including The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, BBC Radio, the Asian Wall Street Journal, and the Vancouver Sun. Today's event will feature an insightful conversation, after which we will open up the discussion to some of the questions that were submitted in advance. Dr. Sajoo, we are so delighted to have you and our guest, Dr. Zine, here on this virtual stage. Thank you for making the time.
Many thanks, Alina, for your kind introduction and for emceeing us today. Well, 9/11 has just turned 21. It has cast a shadow long and wide, covering not just North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, but stretching far beyond to China, most notably, as this audience will know, in Xinjiang, India, and the Middle East. Never mind, says The Economist on 9/11's shadow, that Muslims are one of America's most educated religious groups, and that your doctor and elected representatives are likely to be Muslim. Quote, the bigotry of the right reflects its lost status. Likewise in Canada and beyond. In the highly polarized populist cultures where extremism and hate speech are now mainstream, the not so surprising outcomes go beyond spikes in prejudice against minorities to violent acts at mosques and sidewalks. And consider the contrast between how the public sees Ukraine's resistance to Russia's invasion and how it sees Palestine-Israel, and how we respond to refugees from Eastern Europe as opposed to refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. And yet, a whole generation has only known life after September 11th, 2001. The 9/11 generation is shaping the culture of our schools and universities, government and civil society, the media, and public culture. Now, here is a taste of that from the trailer of Marvel's Habib. So let's have that up.
My parents fled from the land they called home to bring me somewhere safe where I could grow up to live a normal life.
Please don't hurt me. Did you kill that guy with bread?
Can you describe the man who saved your life?
He was wearing black. He had a red hat. He was Middle Eastern, I think.
An Arab good guy? We've never seen this before.
The severity of attacks on our world has been unprecedented.
Mama, Baba, I have to tell you something.
And the superhero? And you're saving the world?
Okay, but you should still get a degree, just in case this superhero garbage doesn't work. What? You need a real job, man.
Habib, your country needs you.
It is our duty to save everyone, because that's what heroes do.
Sorry, there's just a quick screening.
It's completely random. We did Hulk last week.
Did I miss the meeting?
Yes, we said it was at 7.
I thought that meant like 7:30, 8, 9. Did you tell your friends my identity?
ابن فاطمة راح law school. تريدني أقول ابني ما سوى شيء؟
He's doing nothing.
I'm a superhero.
Why don't you be like Doctor Strange? He is a superhero and a doctor.
A being named Wahesh has threatened to destroy the world.
I'm a supervillain, not a terrorist!
Habib, I have a great responsibility.
I have to protect our city.
Heck? You have to get married. How old do you know, 21? I was married by 13. It's your move, Chief.
If I don't defeat Wahesh, the aunties will never stop gossiping about me.
I don't care if being with you puts me in danger.
ابني ليش لا تسوي هيك بينا؟ كم مرة قلت لك تلاقي لك بنية عربية؟
What did she say?
Habib, we believe you'll be key in saving the world.
Can we count on you?
Inshallah.
What does that mean?
Just say yes or no.
Well, it's challenging not just for the 9/11 generation, but also for their parents, as you can see. And on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce our onstage guest today. Jasmin Zine is professor of sociology and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has served as a consultant to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to UNESCO, amongst others, on guidelines for educators and policymakers on combating Islamophobia. Professor Zine has published widely on Islamic feminism and Muslims in education in the Canadian diaspora. Her books include, and we have an image of the covers, Canadian Islamic Schools, Unraveling the Politics of Faith, Gender, Knowledge, and Identity, Muslim Women, Transnational Feminism, and the Ethics of Pedagogy, the edited collection Islam in the Hinterlands, which is how I got to know her work in the first place, and the just published Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, which will be our focus today. Professor Zine recently testified as an expert witness before the Canadian Senate's Human Rights Committee hearings on Islamophobia, just as I did, as you heard from the introduction. And it's such a pleasure to once again come together virtually and to welcome you, Professor Zine, to our conversation series. Thank you for making the time for us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, may I ask you to give us a sampling of this new book, Under Siege?
Thank you. Let me just say in advance that this is I'm going to read a paragraph from the preface of my book where I outline 3 sort of catalytic issues that prompted me to do this study on the 9/11 generation. So I'll just read one paragraph that speaks to one of the incidents that got me thinking about some of the issues that I wanted to explore more deeply in my research.
Great.
In the late 1980s, Human Concern International and the Qadr family were involved in humanitarian work in Afghanistan and were well respected. Our Muslim Student Association organized a major fundraising campaign via Multicultural Bazaar and Food Fair for HCI to provide aid to Afghan families. There were booths of food, clothing, and artifacts for sale from India, Pakistan, Guyana, Morocco, and Somalia. The event was held in a Catholic school gymnasium. To ensure traffic coordination and safety for the event, we recruited Afghan refugee men who were in Canada for medical aid and rehabilitation to serve as security patrol. They wore traditional Afghan clothing, long tunics, baggy pants, and turbans, and carried walkie-talkies. I imagine now how this scene would play out today if a crowd of Muslims gathered in a Catholic school to raise funds for an organization previously on a terror watch list, with a patrol of Afghan men wearing traditional garments with long beards and carrying walkie-talkies circling around the building. In the present climate of Islamophobic and Orientalist racist fears, this scene would surely have the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service converging on site in full force. Pondering on how this MSA event would be read differently today made me reflect on how Muslim youth must navigate in distinct ways the post-9/11 era of Islamophobia.
Now, you sketch here such a powerful contrast in how social perceptions have shifted when it comes to ordinary Muslim activism on campus, as symbolic of the legacy of 9/11. But like so many of us in the Muslim diaspora, I went to university in London, in the UK, and Montreal long before 9/11. And post-war immigration from the former colonies in Asia, Africa, the Middle East had already sparked a virulent Islamophobia, but without that label. You and I can offer up firsthand accounts of this. So, Professor Zine, what is different, seismic, if you will, about the impact of 9/11 for a new generation of Muslims?
Well, as I point out in my book, Islamophobia didn't begin on September 12th, 2001, or a day after the 9/11 attacks. Islamophobia has a very long history and genealogy. And so over time, there's many iterations of Islamophobia that come to the fore and start to impact societies. So as we recognize that anti-Muslim racism existed prior to this sort of catalytic moment of the 9/11 attacks, the aftermath ushered in a new era of Islamophobia that became institutionalized and then also reflected in public policies and was underwriting this so-called global war on terror. And so I was interested in how this millennial generation of Muslim youth who knew little of the world before them and were coming of age at a time where their faith and identity were suspect. And overnight they became, regarded as dangerous citizens. I wanted to examine how this affected them and how they were navigating this fraught political and cultural terrain. So issues like the surveillance of Muslim youth, we were just talking about campus culture and how that changed. But Muslim youth and Muslim student associations have been surveilled by security agencies in Canada, like CSIS and the RCMP, as well as counterterrorism units. During the course of my field work in this study, where I interviewed 130 youth, Muslim youth across Canada, in various cities from New Brunswick to Vancouver and in between, I sat in on some meetings that Muslim youth were having with agencies that were wanting to speak to them because they were a part of a Muslim student association and that somehow they had become subjects of interest. And that included a phone call that my son got from CSIS the day after he was elected as president of the Muslim Student Association at his university. And so this sort of securitization of Muslim youth, well after 9/11 happened, is part of a, continuing way of casting Muslims, and particularly Muslim youth, as the sort of new folk devil, as potential radicals, potential jihadists, and as potential threats to the nation. And I wanted to understand how this was affecting these youth who were growing up in these very unique conditions. This 9/11 generation is unique in many ways. And some of the ways I found this were really interesting and troubling. For example, this securitization becomes internalized, and the self-surveillance now that Muslim youth place upon themselves, where on the one hand, they would tell me that, when I asked them, how did 9/11 impact you? They would say things like, well, it didn't really affect me. And I would say, okay, so what are your, student associations doing right now? And they would say things like, well, we were planning to go play paintball up north, but we didn't want to be seen as a terrorist cell. So, we decided not to do that. And I would think, oh, okay, but then 9/11 didn't affect you, right? So, then they would say things like, we don't play violent video games in the concourse at the university because we don't want people to see us and think that we are violent or planning an attack or something. And again, but 9/11, didn't affect them. And, I recall myself even self-surveilling or being, concerned when my son and his Muslim Student Association were planning to go up north to have a bonfire in the woods somewhere. And I thought, a whole group of Muslim, youth converging in the woods and lighting fires, are you going to have like all of the, security and SWAT teams all of a sudden converge on you? So we have this sense of self-surveillance of how very innocent actions on the part of Muslim communities and Muslim youth in this case can be read and seen as something more nefarious, or they are imbued with this notion of Muslims as potential risks to public safety.
Yeah, I think the seismic part really has much to do with the new technology that emerged late 90s, early 2000s. So it's not that there wasn't surveillance before, but as you rightly point out, the kind of surveillance now you had post 9/11 with the new technology, and then the internal surveillance, that's quite extraordinary. Now, for over a decade, Islamophobia has been cast both as a phobia, an irrational fear of Islam and Muslims, but also as very well organized. Estimates of the funding behind this networking run into tens of millions of dollars, and you've often called it an industry, like the military-industrial complex that drives the global arms race. But Professor Zine, what drives this Islamophobia industry? In the case of the military-industrial complex, we know it simply profits from the trade in arms. Isn't it much harder to pin down motivations for the Islamophobia industry?
Well, first in my book, I contest the notion that Islamophobia is an irrational fear. And instead, I provide a definition and rationale for understanding it as a system of oppression that translates those fears and animus into individual, ideological, and systemic forms of oppression. And I think that's important to help us understand the multifaceted ways that Islamophobia impacts society. And what I also point out in the book briefly is that what distinguishes Islamophobia from other systems of oppression is that there is an industry behind purveying anti-Muslim hate. Now, I have a major report being released in early October that is titled The Canadian Islamophobia Industry, Mapping Islamophobia's Ecosystem in the Great White North. And this report provides a detailed account about how Islamophobia is organized. And this was a project that I've been doing in partnership with the Islamophobia Studies Center and the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the University of California, Berkeley. So To understand this idea of an Islamophobia industry, the term was actually coined in earlier studies in the United States, such as Fear Inc. in 2011, and then Nathan Lean's influential book on the Islamophobia industry in 2012. And there have been other reports in between that time and now that actually focus on examining the funding behind these networks, such as those done by the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, in the United States, that have been looking at what is essentially a billion-dollar industry in the US that is promoting Islamophobia through various campaigns of propaganda, various organizations whose mandate is really promoting anti-Muslim propaganda and conspiracy theories and so on. Now, my study is the first to examine Islamophobia networks that operate in Canada to foment anti-Muslim controversies. So I talk about the Islamophobia industry in Canada as being comprised of media outlets, political figures, far-right white nationalist groups, Islamophobia influencers and ideologues, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Muslim dissidents, think tanks, security experts, and then the donors who fund these campaigns. So these individuals, groups, institutions comprise these networks that support and engage in activities that demonize and marginalize Muslims in Canada. Now, as for the motivation behind this, some of the players in the Islamophobia industry, whether individuals or groups, for example, Islamophobia influencers like Lauren Southern and Faith Goldie and their former mothership, Rebel Media, have been able to monetize anti-Muslim hate and bigotry. Canadian Muslim dissidents have had ties to major Islamophobia donors in the United States, like the Middle East Forum or the Gatestone Institute. And so there is a kind of careerism that has been derived from trafficking in anti-Muslim propaganda. And so that's why, I and others have conceived of this as an industry. And now there's also a lot of other ideological drivers that undergird the various sectors of the Islamophobia industry and motivate them that I detail in this report, which is an important backdrop for understanding the way Islamophobia is organized and what makes it unique in that sense. And so I touched on this briefly in Under Siege to provide a more nuanced understanding of the complex ecosystem of Islamophobia in Canada.
Right. Now, this reminds me of the beginning of Edward Said's landmark book, Orientalism, where he says, with Disraeli, the East is a career, and the career produces the professionalism of Orientalism and so on at the elite level, and then it peters down. But I would observe that something can be organized and still be irrational. I mean, climate change deniers are organized, they're well-funded, but they're contrary to the science. And therefore, in that sense, they are irrational. People that are opposed to COVID vaccines are fabulously irrational. They think you get autism from vaccines and so on, but they are well organized. So I would suggest that there is a very large element of phobia, of crazy prejudice, raw in all its exposure in Islamophobia, and that it's now being played on and then monetized and turned into very profitable careers and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there are far-fetched conspiracy theories that are among the, interconnected discourses and ideologies that are supporting Islamophobia through these networks. And so, but there is always a rationality and logic within these people's conceptions that support out there. So we would see them as irrational, but we can't, lose sight of the fact that these do translate into whether it's individual actions or and they're sustained by particular ideologies, and then they often, these ideas are not innocent, as Said also warned us about, and they do become translated into public policies. So for me to just have a definition of Islamophobia which is just about irrationality, also only allows us to focus on individuals and their roles, but doesn't allow us to look at structural and systemic, which are very important in terms of how, Islamophobia as a system of oppression is reproduced and is enshrined within policies and practices of the state.
Yeah, I think this play between rationality and having a rationale really shows up when it comes to gender. And you have noted, along with many other scholars, the double-barreled targeting of Muslim women, in particular, both by random acts of harassment, because they're visible in what they wear, and also by officialdom in law and public policy, such as Quebec's recent secularism law, Bill 21. Again, because of what women wear. And this is, of course, intensified since 9/11 for a whole generation. Now, Muslim scholars like yourself have tied this gendered Islamophobia to the legacy of colonialism, in which only Western liberal values can rescue and save, in quote marks, brown Muslim women. It seems to me what is lost here is the recognition of how Muslim women themselves have drawn on their heritage, interpreted by themselves as emancipatory against patriarchy. Sisters in Islam and a slew of global Muslim networks have long been at it. Isn't this an especially exciting counterforce, which is much neglected in Western talk, even by Western scholars?
Yes, the dominant gendered Islamophobic narratives have long denied Muslim women agency and voice when it comes to both articulating and challenging the multiple forms of oppression they face. And, of course, Islamophobia is also, manifest in multiple registers in terms of racial difference, in terms of gender and other forms of intersections. And in all of these cases, Muslims are really not the dominant interlocutors when it comes to narrating our experiences and our identities and so on. That has long been really meanings that have been imposed, particularly on Muslim women and their bodies. And so there is, as you point out, a lot of, organizations that Muslim women have developed over decades to begin to challenge the kinds of oppression that they face. There's also a lot of scholarship on Islamic feminism, which I've also contributed to, that highlights the role of Muslim women as agentic subjects, not passive victims when it comes to challenging both sexism and patriarchy within their communities, as well as Orientalism, racism, and Islamophobia outside of it. And so Muslim women are sort of caught within these sort of multiple landscapes to challenge, both on the one hand, issues within the community, such as sexism, patriarchy, and then having to talk about that in climates where it's taken up in very Islamophobic and racist ways as well, and having to deal with the gendered Islamophobia that they face, which is no longer simply confined to Western nations. We can look at these situations where we're talking about in China, whether we're talking about in India, Kashmir, and in other places globally, because Islamophobia is a global scourge, as we
absolutely, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And Muslim women's bodies resonate in particular ways in the kinds of ideologies underwriting those campaigns that have led to ethnic cleansing and genocide. So there's a kind of biopolitics of fear that Muslim women's bodies tend to engender. And as you rightly pointed out, transnational women's organizations have long played a role in challenging these sort of variegated concerns and have made an impact. But considering that they're up against formidable challenges, right, and large state apparatuses and, as I've mentioned, organized campaigns and, state-sponsored repression, and in many countries, policies like we've seen in Canada, such as Bill 21 and earlier iterations of that are trying to discipline Muslim women's bodies in the public sphere, and sacrifice religious freedom on this altar of secularism, and in the process limit what opportunities are available for Muslim women, for example, in what we've seen in Quebec. And of course, these are policies that we're seeing, in other European nations, in France. And there's always new campaigns to try and focus on Muslim women and curtailing their freedoms and human rights. Under the alibi, that Muslim women's bodies are bearers of either some form of civilizational danger and creeping Sharia, or more recently through the kinds of conspiracies around demographic replacement, that it's the power of women as their reproductive power that is to be feared, because Muslims are going to overpopulate European nations, install Sharia law, and take over. So that sort of biopolitics of fear is very much alive and well in the kinds of conspiracy theories, as well as being referenced in policies. And while we do have Muslim women's organizations globally, as well as in Canada, we have the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. There's a Muslim Women's Feminist Collective in Montreal. There's groups like the Afghan Women's Organization that do a lot in the grassroots. These organizations and groups need a lot more support and strengthening, and the ability to create broader-based alliances so that they can begin to, raise awareness and challenge the issues that they're facing, because it's not simply what they're facing outside of the communities, but there's a whole other layer of what Muslim women are experiencing, within communities as well.
Yeah, in fact, this connects very nicely with a theme that's been running in your work for a very long time. I noticed it in your earlier book, Islam in the Hinterlands, where you point to the tension between formal legal citizenship on the one hand, so migrant or indigenous Muslim women and men can be formal legal citizens on the one hand, and the other aspect of that, which is belonging as an everyday reality. So in Under Siege, a Muslim woman in your study, in your ethnographic study, Zabeda, we've got a slide on this, says, I see myself as a Canadian. I don't find any conflict between these two identities. The problem is other people do. They see me as, you can be either Muslim or you could be Canadian. You can't be both. And then there is South Asian student from Vancouver, Saleha, who says, I was held accountable for anything that anybody who claims association with Islam ever did. That is difficult to grow up with, right? How are you supposed to develop a sense of positive self-identity or connection to Canada? And an Iranian Shia student in Toronto, Mavish, finds her Muslim and Canadian identities, which she values equally, fully compatible, even if this does not make the sound bites on the news. Now, whether this tension is within the person or outside in society's attitudes, you, Professor Zine, conclude that it makes citizenship, quote, contingent. So Islamophobia gets in the way of belonging fully as a citizen, even if you have formal citizenship. My question, isn't this true of other communities as well, Indigenous, Black, Asian, where integration fails, not because the target group is resisting, but because society is resisting? So what do we learn from these other experiences in navigating the journey to a genuinely pluralist, inclusive citizenship?
Yeah, so this is a very important question, and one that is, was central to my book that, examined the issues of identity, belonging, and citizenship through the narratives of Muslim youth that you've read out, and begins to engage some of these more affective registers of Islamophobia and how it impacts the way in which Muslim youth began to see themselves within the nation. And of course, those themes of belonging within the nation, I mean, we have that formal relationship of citizenship with the state, but there's also this notion of a imagined community of the nation, right, that Benedict Anderson talked about in his book, Imagined Communities. And who do we imagine as part of a national imaginary to be part of this nation, and who needs to be exiled from it or doesn't quite belong or fit? And that's also another type of way that we, create categories of belonging and exile, right? When we talk about how marginalized communities are residing within the larger state. And so, it became a central theme in the narratives of the 130 youth I interviewed in this study that represented over 20 ethno-racial groups, who all spoke about this sense of a collective burden of guilt and responsibility that was placed on them because of the 9/11 attacks, and they were called into account to be responsible for, to account for it and bear some responsibility. So a lot of these youth were, sitting in classrooms when the Twin Towers were falling, and immediately everyone would turn to them. And the teacher would even ask, what do you think about this? As your people are the ones have done this. So they get these kinds of, remarks directed toward them that, start to give them the impression that they are no longer seen, if they ever were entirely, as members of the nation, but that their citizenship and belonging kind of became contingent after that, in terms of how they would perform their identities as the good Muslim and not the bad Muslim, right? That dichotomy that Mahmoud Mamdani proposed. And I think that that's a very predominant theme in terms of the research that I was doing, that Muslim youth felt this burden of responsibility to be the image corrective and to perform the good Muslim, and that would give them, acceptance and belonging in society, right? So they were very often trying to be conscious of things that they did in public, giving up their seat on subways or smiling at people, just so that people would not simply label them via a stereotype that distanced them from, the national narrative, but rather, saw them, as, peace-loving citizens, which they—
The good Muslims, right?
The good Muslims, yeah. So that playing that good Muslim, bad Muslim, was a dominant theme. And I think there are other issues at play. I mean, I talked about the Islamophobia industry, but what's also very salient is what I call this notion of liberal Islamophobia, where, we have policies and practices of the multicultural state that celebrate diversity. We have Islamic History Month, and we want to have the saris, samosas, and steel bands kind of festivals to celebrate different ethnic cultures and religions and so on. On the other hand, we have policies and practices that target Muslim communities, such as Bill 21, security policies, this barbaric Cultural Practices Act that was named in a way that was very pejorative and reproduced idioms of colonial racism and seemed to be tied to Muslim cultures. And so you have that sort of Islamophilia meets Islamophobia and this sort of paradox, right? That I think that liberal form of Islamophobia, which has also been echoed, as we know, and dog whistled by politicians. We think of the Harper era and his comments about Islamicism being the greatest threat.
And it's not over with politicians at the moment.
Well, exactly. That is not something that simply, ended with that Harper era. There's many iterations of this, but those particular kinds of views and dog whistles and so on also do a lot to normalize Islamophobia, far more than the Islamophobia industry even does. It has a way of normalizing that and, giving us a sense of, who belongs in the nation and who doesn't. And that further challenges, or further antagonizes this kind of contingency of belonging.
Yeah. Now, here is something that you and I have to grapple with, and I've asked this to my professor guests before because of what universities do to us, which is they put our specializations into silos, right? So no matter what your specialization, you are going to feel yourself confined in law or economics or history or philosophy. But Professor Zine, as a sociologist, how do you approach teaching in ways that equip your students to grasp the cross-disciplinary contours of Islamophobia, which has no silos? Like the coronavirus, it's all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. As you know, there are few courses that are taught on Islamophobia in Canada at all. My courses, I think, are among a handful, despite the deadly consequences of Islamophobia in Canada. And nor do we have things like Canada research chairs in Islamophobia studies or research centers and so on. And so, I am a co-founder of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, which is a multidisciplinary scholarly association that's dedicated to providing this global architecture for the field of Islamophobia studies. Because one of the things we find in this area is that Islamophobia is often seen as a free-for-all, where anyone and everyone can engage without consideration for the disciplinary heritage that exists within the field. And so our organization, the acronym is ISRA, wants to ensure that this remains a field of rigorous academic inquiry that builds on the legacies of scholars that have been contributing. And so for me, I approach Islamophobia as a sociologist, but this field of study of Islamophobia studies is inherently interdisciplinary. So I have, in my courses, readings from scholars in history, political science, cultural studies, security studies, psychosocial studies, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary pathways help unpack the complexities of Islamophobia that are critical to understanding the manifestation of Islamophobia in its multifaceted ways, and also directing us to the different kinds of ways we need to challenge it. So I think it's impossible to address Islamophobia from a siloed perspective, but at Muslim Studies at Laurier, we've been able to draw scholars from across disciplines as part of our program. So we have folks from languages and literature, history, global studies, women's studies, and myself from sociology, as well as Islamic studies scholars as part of this Muslim studies option.
That's marvelous, and you're clearly way ahead of the curve. Now we're running short of time, so I'm going to get to my final question before we turn to the audience. In case anyone thought that the 9/11 generation is taking Islamophobia lying down, Professor Zine, your final chapter in Under Siege looks at their creativity in cinema, in theater, in stand-up comedy, and you call these counter publics who refuse to be victims and instead, quote, imagine alternative futures, including on interfaith relations, on Palestine, the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And your son, Yusuf Zine, is among these highly creative figures in Canada. Now, you've brought us samples of these, which we have on screen, I gather. Could you speak to that, please?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to end this book with the understanding that Muslim youth are not just victims of these circumstances, right? That rather they are agentic subjects who are engaged in creative modalities of resistance. And so, as you can see on the screen, there's just some images here, where through storytelling, contemporary, voices are added to this historical repository of resistant Muslim narratives. So we have, histories of resistance that, we can draw upon. And Muslim youth are now actively representing their lives and experiences in ways that subvert, these sort of colonial and imperial scripts through which Muslim identities and experiences have often been coded. And so I was very interested in the work of Muslim cultural producers, and I spoke to spoken word artists engaged in theater, comedy, documentary film, that comprise what I call these Muslim counterpublic spaces, where these storytellers provide testimony to their own experiences of marginality, but also use the arts as a form of what I call public pedagogy and resistance. And so, as you can see here on the one image, there's an image of one of the first female spoken word artists in Canada, and we also see some posters here of some films. For example, I Am Rohingya, Genocide in 4 Acts, which was actually done by my son, who was the writer, director, producer of this, who brought together a group of Rohingya refugee youth in Canada who wanted to do a play based on the stories and experiences of their family in the genocide in Myanmar and their experience coming to Canada. So that was captured in a 4-act play, as well as through this documentary film. And then also an interesting intervention by a Canadian, theater actor and comedian who formed a group called Conflict Relief, which is an Israeli-Palestinian comedy troupe. And they met at a theater program in London in the UK. And, you know, in the midst of having arguments with each other about politics, started to find that futile and wanted to create an intervention where they could create some satire around those conflicts. But then also after they present this comedy show, they would go out in the audience and debrief and talk to the audience about, you know, how they felt about it, what the messages they were trying to convey, how that was taken up. And so that really does become an educational project as much as it is comedy. And comedy can be very disarming and allow people to sort of drop their guard. And
it gets under the radar, yes.
Yeah, you know, it has a way of reaching. And I always find the arts and, you know, even spoken word poetry I use in my classes because it draws people in a more visceral way and invites them into an experience that they wouldn't have otherwise. And so I thought the work of these artists were really compelling, and I wanted to showcase that. And also, you know, similarly to in my other book on Muslim women and transnational feminism, we talked to Muslim women who are artists and cultural producers. I think it's really important to showcase that work as the kind of counter narratives that we need. And we're starting to see more of that in mainstream as well with the popularity of shows like Rami. There's a new series, Mo, that's out that's talking about Palestinian American experiences. You know, a Muslim lead as a Syrian refugee on the series Transplant. You know, the first Muslim superhero in the Marvel universe, Miss Marvel, is out now. So, you know, we're starting to see some movements towards mainstreaming, you know, Muslim experiences, and that it's Muslim artists that are doing this work, I think is so significant.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Transplant because we had one of the writers as a guest on the show, and it's tremendous how art and culture and comedy in particular penetrate the people's consciousness and subconsciousness.
By the way, I did want to point out that the spoken word artist who's pictured on the screen is the wonderful Sophia Beg, who was one of the first Muslim women to do spoken word poetry, and she got to be known internationally.
Well, and rightly so, Jasmin. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask our MC to get us into the audience Q&A now. People have very patiently listened to our formal conversation, so it's time that we listened to what's on their minds.
Well, thank you both so much for this insightful conversation. I know I enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Dr. Sajoo, like you mentioned, we'll now move to the audience Q&A, and we'll be touching on some questions that were shared by our audience. So our first question is likely top of mind for many folks listening in with us today, given the always increasing use of social media in our society. But social media is a big part of the post 9/11 reality. It's said to democratize free speech, but it amplifies Islamophobia, but at the same time can help mobilize a resistance to it. In your view, is social media reconfiguring belonging and citizenship in society?
Well, that's a great question. You know, and I think it's absolutely right to point out the role of social media that is so pervasive and that everyone is constantly connected through in multiple platforms, you know, as playing a role within this sort of wider sphere of where Islamophobic ideas can circulate, but can also be challenged. You know, so I think it's a sort of has opportunities for both. My research has looked, you know, at how social media platforms have been incubators for, you know, Islamophobic hate groups and platforms for what I call Islamophobia influencers. Earlier, I mentioned people like Lauren Southern, Faith Goldie. There's many others, you know, internationally that use social media and monetize their websites, right? So this is how they also are able to draw revenue, although there's been, you know, movement on the parts of platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to deplatform a lot of these sort of hate mongers and not allow them to draw revenue from their websites. So I think, you know, it's a positive move to start to regulate and control where those very disturbing kinds of narratives are being purveyed, the propaganda, the conspiracy theories are, have been circulating with a great deal of impunity on these sites. And so I think it's important. We also, have hate speech laws and, in Canada, although it's a very, very high threshold, and there are many, there have been many challenges to some of these, hate mongers and trying to bring them before, the courts. And yet there hasn't been enough done to stem the tide of a lot of this hate propaganda. So, there's also other ways in which, algorithms are being hijacked by a number of these groups. So what I talk about in the Islamophobia industry study is that, if you're Googling certain information about Islam and Muslims, certain topics, you will actually immediately go to these problematic sites. And those will be the top hits. I found that myself when I was doing the study. So, there's a number of ways in which there are very orchestrated disinformation campaigns, that are funded and that actually are, gaining more traction in promoting Islamophobic propaganda online. And so I think it's an important question. And I think there needs to be, particularly for, young people, more sort of critical literacy and awareness of how do we sift through, fact and fiction? How do we fact check things? People accept knowledge often face value. And it takes a lot of effort and knowledge to kind of sift through what we're presented with, because a lot of these, propaganda type of stories and websites and so on can be seen as being, something that is bona fide. And so it takes a lot of effort to try and have a kind of critical digital literacy.
Yeah, and I think we're at the beginning of that learning curve on media literacy. I mean, in historical terms, social media is a very, very young phenomenon. There's a lot we don't know about the ropes, and our idealism at the beginning of it about democratization and inclusion and so on often turned out to be illusory. But I'm sure we have more questions from the audience, Alina.
Yes, we definitely do. This next one is a really thoughtful question, and thank you so much both for your response on the one above. So Mohsin Hamid, the celebrated Pakistani-American writer, recently said in The New Yorker, and I'm just going to quote now, "After 9/11, I experienced a profound sense of loss. I was constantly stopped at immigration, held for hours at the airport. I had become an object of suspicion, even fear. I had lost something. Over the years, I had begun to realize that I lost my partial whiteness. Not that I had been white before. I am brown-skinned, with a Muslim name. But I had been able to partake in many of the benefits of whiteness, and I had been complicit in that system." Is this sense of loss a feature not just of the 9/11 generation, but also the diaspora of Muslims at large?
Before you respond, Professor Zine, just so the audience gets whom you are referring to, it's Mohsin Hamid, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, the author most recently of The Last White Man. Okay, over to you, Professor Zine. Your thoughts on that New Yorker quote?
Well, I, absolutely agree with a kind of sense of, difference and perhaps loss in terms of the post 9/11 context. Of course, my book was looking at a generation that, what happened and transpired after 9/11 and that backlash became kind of a new normal for them. So they didn't always necessarily register loss in, let's say, the way our generations did, because we understood that. Although I would not characterize racialized and marginalized Muslim communities in the West as having any purchase of whiteness or being able to piggyback off of white privilege in any particular way. I mean, as Dr. Sajoo pointed out in the beginning, Islamophobia has had a long resonance and history within Western nations prior to the 9/11 attacks. Anti-Muslim racism existed prior to 9/11, and I think for those of us who have grown up in, Western societies as racialized folks, as Muslims, we have a long history of dealing with that particular kind of racism. And so, we learn to navigate within it. And, there are things that might minimize what you experience if you, let's say, speak without a quote unquote foreign accent. Whiteness is a culture of power. People learn how to navigate within it, but I don't believe that we actually benefit from it. It's, to me, a misunderstanding of white privilege, which is essentially about power. And marginalized groups do not have access to that power. And so I think that's what trips me up on that quote, is talking about the pre 9/11 as having some access to white privilege or partial white privilege. I don't agree with that, but I do agree that for our generation, myself as a boomer, I clearly felt a shift after 9/11 in terms of how Muslim identities were perceived. Not that they were perceived positively before, but as we've been talking about in this discussion, we started to see more institutionalized forms of Islamophobia, systemic forms of Islamophobia, and Muslims being characterized in very specific ways as the kind of folk devil of, jihadists, terrorists. Probably prior to that, there were a lot more cultural understandings of Muslims as sort of maybe being backward. Men are misogynistic, women are, oppressed. I was doing research on Muslim youth prior to 9/11, my first book. And, that's actually when I coined the term gendered Islamophobia, was to talk about some of the experiences of these young Muslim women who were wearing hijab, who were having all of these negative encounters in the public sphere. That was long before 9/11. I wore hijab myself for 17 years, and prior to 9/11 had lots of negative encounters and experiences. So, I don't think that I agree with that quote in terms of the ideas that marginalized racial communities like Muslims ever had any kind of access to white privilege.
Well, in fairness, it was my fault for expanding what he was saying only about himself, right? In my question, he was just saying that he himself was in a privileged position. And then I generalized that to whether this was true of a large part of the pre-9/11 generation. But I think he would agree with you that by and large, for marginalized communities as a whole, the loss is much more profound and rarely ever involved partaking in white privilege. I think as a writer, and also particularly when his bestseller, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, was turned into a movie, he's got a couple of elite Muslim New York financial types who do enjoy that kind of privilege. And I think he was only limiting it to that. But back to the audience questions, Alina.
Thank you so much. I know that was a little bit of a complex question as well. So thank you, and we appreciate your response on that one. I think we have time for one last question. So there's a lot of activist commentary in Canada and beyond about using anti-hate laws to combat Islamophobia, especially with the spat of hate crimes. But if Islamophobia is part of a wider wave of extremism, we need a shift in public opinion that goes into the ethics of citizenship. That requires civic education, not just in schools and universities, but also for those in media and public servants. Do you agree with that statement? And I'd love to kind of hear you expand some more on that thought.
Thank you. I often characterize trying to, challenging Islamophobia as like playing a game of whack-a-mole. When you go to like a carnival and there's that game where you've got a mallet and there's this mole that keeps popping up and you keep hitting it and it comes up somewhere else. So, Islamophobia is a lot like that. When we focus on one thing, there's another way in which it manifests. And so, hate crimes, and in Canada, of course, we've had the 2 terror attacks in this country that, have been unprecedented. On January 29th, 2017, the attack at the Quebec City Mosque. And then in last year, in 2021, on June 6th in London, Ontario, where a Pakistani Canadian Muslim family was mowed down by a truck, and both incidents happening at the hands of white nationalists. And so we need to talk about hate crimes. We need to talk about violent and deadly forms of Islamophobia that are manifesting in this country. But, from where I sit, and the kind of research I do, I find, there's a lot of different aspects of Islamophobia that need to be addressed. So hate crime laws can be one avenue. Again, a lot of emphasis on even things like hate speech, though, have high thresholds. But what that sort of hate speech does as a prelude, often to violence, creating a kind of, breeding ground for Islamophobic ideas and sentiments to exist. As I mentioned, there's also the policies that exist and reinforce and normalize Islamophobia. There's also the industries and so on. So I see it as very complex. And in terms of the kind of counter narratives and education that we need to have done to provide, alternative understandings about Muslim communities and to begin to sort of rewrite that script. And so I see it as a broader project. I think legislation is one thing, and there can be some pitfalls and issues within that as well that legal scholars, speak about. But there's a lot more in terms of, as I've mentioned before, the effect of security policies, the effect of other kinds of ways that Muslim communities are being, rendered suspect or as undesirable citizens through the secularism laws and so on. So it's very complex, and I think the response to Islamophobia needs to match those different dimensions.
Oh, that's fascinating, and I think we've run out of Q&A time. Yes, Alina?
Yes, I think we're just coming up at the end here.
Okay, so I've got a teaser for the audience. I'm going to have a quote up on the slides here, which captures what Professor Zine has just been talking about in terms of the big picture, the context in which Islamophobia fits into a relationship between Western modernity and the Muslim world. And if you could have that slide up with a quote, I'm going to ask the audience whether you can guess who said this. And it's somebody very prominent. And here is a further teaser. You're hearing a lot about this person in the media right now. And this is what that person, you'll have to guess whether it's a he or a she, said. Diplomacy, free trade, open borders, techniques of academic research, anthropology, etiquette, fashion, alternative medicine, hospitals, all came from this great city of cities, Cordoba, in Muslim Spain. Islam has been a part of Europe for so long, first in Spain, then the Balkans, and the extent to which it has contributed so much towards a civilization which we all too often think of wrongly as entirely Western. And furthermore, it is part of our own inheritance, not a thing apart. Okay, who do you think said this? And I'll give you a further clue. It wasn't a Muslim. Okay, so we'll count up to 5 for someone to shout that aloud. And the answer is King Charles III. All right, when he was Prince of Wales at Oxford University in 1993. I think it's a remarkable statement of acknowledgement from the elite Western platform that he occupies now as the king of Canada as well as the United Kingdom. And the context it provides, I think, is extraordinarily important about the relationships whose distortion leads to what we've been talking about today, Islamophobia as a legacy of Orientalism. Well, I really want to thank Professor Zine for taking up from her extraordinarily busy time as the semester has gotten underway, the teaching semester, to Alina for emceeing us today, for all the hardworking audiovisual people that allow this virtual session to happen. I've enjoyed this thoroughly, and I look forward to having our audience back for 2 more sessions. So on October the 22nd, if you happen to be with us in Vancouver, we have Professor Kamal Al-Soleili, who is the head of the UBC School of Journalism, as my guest at the Ismaili Center, Vancouver. And finally, we will have a virtual session with Professor Muhammad Fadol, which was going to be an in-person, but is now going to be a virtual global session on the ethics of citizenship. So that will be screened right after the session on October the 22nd. I want to thank everybody for joining us now and in anticipation of being with us for our 2 future events. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sajoo. And on behalf of the Ismaili Center Toronto, I'd like to convey a special thank you to Dr. Sajoo and Dr. Zine for sharing their knowledge, experiences, insights, and transformational views. And thank you all so much for joining us in this virtual conversation as part of the Ethics of Citizenship series. So we look forward to seeing you all again at the next few events, and thank you so much for your time.